Yes.
I'm just messaging Dan real quick to make sure he's okay. Run! First of all, you eat during church, then you. Did you put the sour cream in the refrigerator?
Yep.
It's in the fridge. The fridge isn't that big. He hears us, but he can't see us. Is our camera on?
Yeah.
Hey Dan, try using the comment section so Tony can chat with you if need be. All right. Is he squared away?
I don't know.
All right. Dan is joining us. He's trying to figure out how to be able to see us versus just hear us. I personally think it might be a boon to only hear us, not have to look at us. I mean, nothing personal about my audience. All right, so we're in Genesis 18 through 22, which is we have the Sodom and Gomorrah. We have Sodom and Gomorrah. We have the birth of Isaac, and we also have the binding of Isaac, or the offering of Isaac. And so I guess first of all, I just want to kind of open the floor up real quick and see if anybody has any questions from this section, whether it be because you've read the section this week and you have some thoughts or questions about it, or just in general. This tends to be a section of the text that has a lot of history that has been used, misused, and talked about at great length. So just wanted to open the floor to see if there's any thoughts or questions about this passage. Able to see us yet?
Apparently not.
Well, why do you guys think of a question? I'm going to see if I can see us. Of course. All right, I'm not going to do that. But he can hear us? Okay. Well, we probably won't know if there's something broke with it unless someone else logs on and expresses whether or not they can see us. The camera light is lit.
I see the image.
Okay. Way to go, Dan. You broke the internet. All right, so Sodom and Gomorrah. Anything, folks? Nothing? We're all good on Sodom and Gomorrah. We're all good on Isaac. Remember last week when Thomas said Don has a lot of stuff he's got to do, so he doesn't have a lot of time to put into prepping for the week? That was kind of hoping that you guys would have some questions, so that way we could talk about stuff.
You provide a nice overview.
What's that?
It's lovely to have a nice overview on the topic of Don's eyes.
From my eyes, well, I will give you that as soon as you guys ask some questions.
So what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah?
Well, no, why don't you tell me the stories? Why don't you tell me the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and what you remember of it?
I'm running through. I just need to see a picture. Oh.
He said, "Is an image or there isn't one?"
It is.
Oh. So Tony or Dan broke the internet. Can you let him know someone else was able to see the? Well, I guess I just did if he's able to hear me.
So my history's a little rough.
That's okay. Does anybody else have an overview?
Did the city somehow like deteriorated, right? Or is that a different one?
Well, I mean, in a lot of different manners, that is correct.
They're leaving and don't look back, and then
So that's Lot and his family. Yep.
and then there's some. Yeah, I should pass it on to Chris.
Okay, Chris.
So Abraham is visited by 3 individuals. Can I ask a question on that part before we go any further?
Sure.
Those 3 individuals in my upbringing had been taught to me to be understood as like the Holy Spirit, God the Father, and Jesus, the Son of God,
Okay.
in a manifestation of 3 human beings. What is like the Jewish understanding or tradition around that story before we actually get into Sodom and Gomorrah?
Well, the 3 strangers would have been 3 messengers of God, and God would have been independent of the 3. So when we read this section, so 18:1 says, "And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day." So that's one thing. So in this scene, in verse 1, Abraham is meeting with God. Okay? It says, he then lifted his eyes. I added then, bless you, Tony. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him, independent from God. Okay? I think, Chris, your upbringing, that is probably how most people that grew up in the church, probably, whether that was explicitly taught or implicitly taught, they thought the 3 strangers represented in some way the Trinity. I think that's a relatively common teaching. I would argue the text doesn't allude to that, and what I would argue instead is that there are 3 strangers in addition to Abraham meeting with God in his tent, opening of his tent. And if you noticed, so you have the 3 strangers, they interact with Abraham. 2 strangers go to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? There's only 2 strangers at Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
And then when Lot and his family are leaving, there's only 1 messenger with them. So within Jewish imagination is that each one of these messengers, as is always the case when you run into a messenger of God, they have one specific job. And so once they complete the job, they go away. They return to the heavens, whatever it might be. This is the imagination of Israel. And so the first messenger out of the 3, what was that messenger's job? According to the text.
It's weird because like a lot of the initial interaction is like phrased as they.
Mm-hmm.
So.
But what is they? What is they's first job?
To give them a son?
Yeah, to announce Isaac, right? To let them know that they're going to have a child. But then, go ahead, Mark.
That just still goes, I guess I don't understand the Jewish thought then. If this messenger's job is done, and he says, I'm going to come back in a year, then why does he go down to, or I guess I don't know which one goes down to Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right, in fact, that's what they say, is that he doesn't go to Sodom and Gomorrah because only 2 go to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So when we read in 19, verse 1, what does it say?
Sorry.
19.
Other one. Two angels arrived in Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city.
Right. So in this scene, there's only 2 angels. So one of the angels does not go.
So we're just assuming that the one who's going to come back later is just doesn't.
Right. In fact, so I would even say within the interpretive imagination, they don't think that there was literally like one angel. They had one job. They had a name and they had an assignment. They came and they left. They think that the messengers, the 3 messengers, is metaphorical of there's 3 things about to happen. Okay.
Oh, I see.
There's the pronouncement of the birth. There is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then there's the rescue of Lot.
They don't include like the dialogue between Abraham and God as a.
That's completely independent of these.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So that's happening, right? And again, this is where it's all interpretive imagination,
Sure.
right? Because this isn't meant to be, it's not like a mathematics problem that there is a definite answer here as to how this plays out. Instead, Israel is trying to understand when they read this text, why were there 3, and then why were there 2, and then why were there 1? Oh, because each angel had a specific task that they were trying to accomplish. And so this story is about 3 acts. Right? So this story is broken down into 3 separate acts. The first act is the promise of descendants to Abraham. The second act is the threat of destroying and then the actual destroying of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then the third act is the rescuing of Lot on behalf of Abraham. Right? Is that helpful? So within Israel's mind, none of the 3, and I'm sure you could probably find some Jewish writings where one of the 3 is indeed Yahweh. Jewish thought is just as vast as Christian thought about the text, and so you can find. But what seems to be the majority view is Abraham's in his entrance of his tent, meeting with God. He looks up, sees 3 strangers coming. So God's here, and 3 strangers are coming. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Back to you. That was your question you said before you continued.
Oh, so well, you brought up 19:1 when Margaret asked this question.
Yes.
Lot sitting in the gateway of the city. Is that some kind of like established office or position that represents something? To be sitting in the gate of the city, what is that?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're in, you sit in the city gates, it's basically our equivalent to sitting in city council or sitting in town hall. So you have some official capacity. You're a leader or a decision maker within the community.
So we could read that Lot had like a position or some
It's
measure
some
of
level of
influence.
authority
Interesting.
or influence. Definitely influence and possibly authority, let's say it that way. Yeah.
Cool.
Did you want to continue in on the story, or?
I'd love to popcorn this, pass along the torch if someone's willing to be next.
Okay, I'll go next.
Thank you, Mark.
So the first day, or whatever, person comes and then say that you're going to have a son, even though you didn't think you could have a son. And then Abraham pleads with God for the salvation of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God is wanting to destroy them for being extremely sinful, despite giving them plenty of time to repent. And Abraham talks back and says, well, if there's a certain number of righteous people in the cities, will you save them? And he says, yes. And then Abraham whittles down that number, so sort of, and asks again. So start with 50, and then 45, and 40, and so on and so forth. And each time God says, yes, I'll save them. And then he says, yes, if there's 20 righteous people, I'll not destroy it. And then it comes down to 10, which represents the smallest, 10 is the smallest number of people you could have to have a congregation or something.
Yeah, it'd be a quorum. Yep. So it's the smallest number of people.
So then God agrees, if there's 10 righteous people, I will save both cities. And so it must have picked up popcorn.
Well,
That's through 18. Basically.
Yeah. So let's maybe take a moment and talk about 18. So if you notice in verse 20, it says in chapter 18, verse 20, it says, "The Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know." And so I think that that's a really important verse that oftentimes when we're retelling this story, we kind of forget. So first of all, there are people that are crying out because Sodom and Gomorrah were so wicked and evil.
That's just really interesting because oftentimes this particular story has been framed in such a way where it's like everyone is so awful that God can like just hear how everybody is so awful. But to read it as like people are also experiencing the injustice taking place and they're pleading to God, it's a very different way.
Yeah, and then God goes down seemingly to be present to judge whether or not the outcry is indeed accurate. And so in this picture, so first of all, I guess the first thing I want to say is, I'm going to maybe reshape the story slightly, and those of you that have gone through this passage before with me, this will be probably familiar. But imagine this. So Abraham, in the last section of Genesis, has just basically signed the covenant with God. This is the first time we see Abraham having a conversation with God after the covenant has been signed. Okay? So the very first discussion after Abraham and God become like this, right? Abraham is sitting in the tent, in the entrance of the tent. God is meeting with him one-on-one. 3 complete strangers who Abraham has no idea who they are. He sees them off in the distance. And what is his reaction?
To serve them?
Before he serves them.
He bows to the ground.
He gets up and runs to them. Right? So it says, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them. And so I realize that sometimes our English language can give a different impression, like as if they were like standing right in front of him when he noticed them. But then he went and had to run to them. So he gets up, he runs to them. In effect, doing what?
Did he just leave God?
Yeah, he leaves God. And I just think that that's so profound, and we don't notice it. One, because we oftentimes will make God one of the 3. But think about this picture. 3 complete strangers. Abraham's having a face-to-face conversation, if you will, with God. And his reaction to 3 strangers is that they supersede the conversation with God. Like, that's unbelievable. Like, how many of you can imagine a situation where you're having this moment, the Shekinah of God, the manifestation of God's presence is with you. You feel in some way as though God is right there beside you, and you are having this intimate relationship that very few people in history can articulate. and you notice off in the distance 3 people you've never met before. You have no idea who they are. You have no idea what they're doing, where they're heading, what's going on. And you're like, shh, shh. And then you get up and you leave God and you leave God's presence to go. And when you get there, you fall on your face before them. And you ask how you can serve them. And you actually beg in some way to care for them. Like, to me, that is so outside of what I think most of our paradigms would be, right? Like, for me, I would love to say, oh, yeah, if I was having a face-to-face conversation with God and I saw somebody walking. Abraham has no idea if these men are in need. He has no idea if they actually are hungry, if they're tired. He knows nothing about them. For all he knows, they have a huge caravan behind them that's just on the other side of the hill, and they need nothing from him. Yet he still leaves this powerful worship experience with God to go out to them. And what do you guys think about that? Like, have you ever thought about this section in that way before?
It's humbling.
Yeah, isn't it? It's crazy. I'd like, because again, I would love to think, of course I would do that.
Well,
Don't think I probably.
he also is doing this out of like instinct or like character because we don't have Torah. So there are no like explicit commands to like care, to be hospitable, and to serve. And it just reminds me of his like initial like calling, his willingness to get up and leave and go, despite having any kind of like written instruction to reference. So I think it's just like a deeper insight into his character, which is pretty cool.
Yep, agree. Any other thoughts? Have you guys ever considered this passage that way before? I mean, heck, if I'm in the middle of a good book, I don't get up and go take care of someone. In fact, I see strangers all the time, and I just ignore them and try not to make eye contact in order that I might not have to even say hello to them, right? And don't get me wrong, I don't think this means that we're supposed to basically lay on our face in front of every person that walks by all the time. I think that would be a misappropriation of this text. But I think it really is a very profound scene where Abraham, who God says he doesn't want to tell Abraham what he's about to do in Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? What does the text say? Why does God not want to tell Abraham what he's going to do? Someone read chapter 18, verses 17 through 19.
And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him.
Keep going. One more verse.
For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised."
So God is debating whether or not to even tell Abraham what he's going to do in Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because Abraham is a just man. That's a crazy thought. Right? That God's like, should I let Abraham know what I'm going to do? Because he's a just man. Probably going to have a problem with this.
So is that to say that God in this narrative is somehow aware that the actions God is about to take could be viewed as not just?
I think that that's at least suggested. I mean, God's going to destroy him, and we get the impression, don't we, that if Abraham doesn't intervene, that God wasn't even going to bother to count the righteous. Right?
Why would that be the case?
Because God's going to destroy it, and until Abraham brings up 50 righteous people, there's no mention that God was going to preserve Sodom and Gomorrah, regardless of how many righteous people.
How is it conceptualized that God would do that? It's just because the town's not doing so hot. And it's the restart thing, like the Noah concept coming alive again. Is this before or after?
It's after Noah.
So how does that work?
So,
It's just
Alright.
like restart button on Sodom and Gomorrah.
so what I would argue, and I realize that for some of us, this could be a completely different way of reading the text. And so if this is not the way that you feel connected reading the text, I understand. But what I would argue is, so when Jesus tells parables, he has how many points when he tells a parable? He tells a parable 3 different ways usually, but how many points does he have?
Usually there's just a singular point.
Right, there's 1 point of the parable, right? And if you start trying to find multiple points, you start to make it into something. It's like a fable, for instance, or the moral of the story when you watch a fictional movie or show or read a fictional story that has a moral of the story. If you try to pull too many other things out of there, it eventually begins to fall apart. And so what ends up happening, we do the same thing, unfortunately, when we read some of Jesus' parables, we want to make it about the priest, about the Levite, about the Samaritan, about the innkeeper, about the man that was beat up and left dead along the road. We also want to make it about the people that beat him up and left him along the road. Heck, let's even make it about the pathway. I'm talking about the Good Samaritan story. Let's even talk about the pathway in which they traveled that went through the tough parts of the mountains. And eventually, we miss that there was a singular point that Jesus is responding to a question of who is my neighbor. And so there's only 1 point in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is who is my neighbor. He's not actually making any case against Levites or against priests or against robbers or against the person that was left dead or any of that. He's telling a story that has a singular point. I would argue the same thing is true here, is that there's a singular point about this story when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not about whether or not God was actually unjust and was going to do this, but something significant changes right here that's different than any other place we see in the text up until this moment. Anybody have a guess?
Is it someone's intervention? Or something like that?
Close. That's good. That's on the right track.
Changes his mind.
We see God change his mind. At least he repents about the flood. I realize that was post-flood, but he changes his mind. I think you can make a case when he makes humankind without gender and then changes his mind and genders or creates genders within humankind. Adam and Eve, when they sinned, what did it affect?
Just themselves.
I think everything. Including future generations, not in the way of original sin like we often talk about, the fact that future generations didn't have access to the garden anymore, and that the land would be hard to till, and that women would suffer in greater childbirth, that type of thing. And again, I think all of that is meant metaphorically as imagery, though I do believe women do suffer in childbirth. And so then we have Noah. And what happens in Noah? So you have one person's wickedness affects everything. Noah, what happens? Right, but sticking with that theme.
Like the wickedness of everyone else preserves him in some way. He stands out.
I would argue wickedness affects wicked, righteous affects righteous, but in some way Noah's righteousness in some way carries over to his immediate family. Right? Why do you're
Can you start from again?
so in the garden, the sin of Adam and Eve affect the entire creation. In the flood narrative, the wickedness of the people, they pay for their own wickedness. But Noah's righteousness, it says Noah was the only righteous person, yet God preserves his wife his sons and his sons' wives, which means in some way his righteousness actually created a bubble that preserved a family. Okay? Now we have in Sodom and Gomorrah, what is Abraham's argument this time? How many cities are in the Sodom and Gomorrah story?
So it's like his righteousness will preserve these 5 cities?
The argument is that if there's even 10 righteous people, that 5 cities of wicked, the epitome of wicked, like we have back in the flood, would be preserved. And so we all of a sudden have this progression, right? We see where at Garden, one man's wickedness or failure to follow and be obedient to God affects all of creation. We have the flood narrative where one man's righteousness saves his family, so it saves a few. And now we have where a few can save the many. We have this flip. Now righteousness is more powerful than wickedness. We don't see that prior, right? We see, and I think as Christians, we would argue that that continues to grow until one man's righteousness overcomes all evil, right? So we see this progression in the text. In fact, the picture is in the Hebrew that God stands before Abraham, right? So if I said, I have to go stand before a judge, who's in authority in that picture? Yeah, you don't say I'm going to go stand before the judge, and no one listening to that probably assumes that you're the one in charge of that conversation. So the Hebrew is that God stands before Abraham when Abraham says, what about 50? What about 40? What about 30? What about 20? What about 10? Right? And so God is actually interacting. I realize for us that's really hard because many of us, whether it be God changing his mind, whether it be God going down to see if it's true as if he wouldn't already know, whether it be God can't seem to place Adam and Eve in the garden, he can't find them, he's looking around. Those are all attributes or characteristics of God that many of us within Western Christendom have not been raised to think of God in having any kind of limitation, much less to stand before someone and learn, right? Regardless of whether or not God actually stood before Abraham to learn from him, the picture is really powerful. That this man Abraham, who is the father of our faith, even has authority before God to argue for the salvation of others. So Abraham's first conversation with God once he's within covenant is to plead on behalf of the wicked. Is that not crazy? Like, this scene is so backwards to the way that I was raised in the church, right? And hopefully you guys don't identify with this because it would be fantastic if you don't identify with this. But for me, I was raised to think that I was golden, and I would wag my fingers at everyone around me. Abraham, the most righteous man within Israel's collective mind, right? His very first conversation with God, he cuts short so he can run to greet strangers. And then in the next breath, he argues with God that the most wicked place on the earth, Sodom, Gomorrah, and its 3 sister cities, that they would be preserved if there was even just enough righteous people to make a single quorum. We would say church, right? So think about that. That's unbelievable that this is the argument. What if we prayed that way? What if we took our worship moments, our deepest worship moments, and we put them on hold to serve the complete and utter stranger? And what if we took our opportunity of intercessory prayer to stand before God and plead for his mercy for the wicked? What would that do? What do you guys think? How would that change you? How would that change church? How would that change Christendom? How would that change the world? I think we would be so merciful. We would be so hospitable. We would be so generous. We would be so welcoming because we would not assume anyone was not deserving of being cared for, being saved, being served. Like, whether we like to think it or not, all of us have a line in which we say that person is undeserving. This right here, Abraham's story in chapter 18, blows up for us any opportunity to actually, with any good standing, declare that someone is undeserving of mercy, of justice, of hospitality, of grace. And there's a difference. So I try to say this every time I call us into really high acceptance, mercy, and generosity towards others. So please make sure you keep this asterisk there. An abusive relationship, as one example of a million I could come up with, it's one thing to demonstrate mercy and grace to that person and extend that and not think that they are beyond deserving salvation, and staying with them and continuing to get pummeled. Those are two different things. Does that make sense? So in no way would I ever encourage in this high level of thinking about demonstrating mercy and grace and compassion to people around you, would I ever call for anybody to therefore put themselves in harm's way. Abraham does not go down to Sodom and Gomorrah. He stays there where he is. It is not safe for him to go into that space, but he still pleads for God's generosity and mercy on them. Do you guys all hear that? I just want to make sure that's very clear, because we can turn around and heap guilt the opposite direction on ourselves and say, well, I should give this person another chance. There's a difference between putting yourself in harm's way and extending mercy and hospitality. Anyone have any question about that? Because I want to make sure we handle that to the nth degree.
Is functioning in that realm today is the idea to convince God of something, or is it liberate us and everyone else? Assuming there's multiple. Because I guess you're proposing that God was going to do one thing, well, based on what you're saying, God was going to do something. It wasn't necessarily a training for Abraham, it was more of a real conversation.
Certainly, and here's what I would say. I would say most of us believe that about prayer, otherwise we would stop praying. Most of us believe that we pray for healing in someone because we think God might, upon hearing our plea, do something he wasn't going to do otherwise.
Oh, because in the Sodom and Gomorrah, it seems like I'm going to kill these people. And he's like, man, can you hold on that? And if I apply that logic now, it's like I'm injuring these people, which I probably not the same concept. Or,
what do you mean you're injuring?
Like if in that scenario, God was the one that was going to act with a response to destroying people, right? Something like that. And then now that logic, like he's not necessarily injuring people or causing all that. Does that make sense? Like in that case, he was going to kill a group of people, but now it's more just like, can you help them? He's not like, I'll get back to you. Did anyone get what I'm saying?
Is God going to destroy somebody?
Yeah, like in that context, he was going to do something about it, but now when we're praying, it's not. I didn't In my head, I'm not praying because I think God's tormenting humanity with sickness and all of these types of things. But in that instance, he was going to ask. Chris, yeah? It seems like a
Well,
I
different.
feel like I'm getting
There was-
closer to understanding.
It was like a real situation, right? That was about to happen.
Yeah, like God was
God
going
was
to be
going
the
to
cause
inflict
of
violence.
a threat. He was a
Right.
threat to the person, but he's not necessarily. I didn't perceive him as a threat to, like right now, like God, please don't hurt them. You know, it's just you're asking.
Well, this goes, okay, so what I would say again, this goes back to there's a single point of this story,
It's
as opposed to how do I apply every piece of this story to modern time. And I would just argue what's happening here is the point of the story as I see it is that Abraham is ushering in a brand new way. He's the father of the Hebrew people. He's ushering in this new relationality with God that insists on justice, mercy, grace, generosity, hospitality, the list goes on and on, in order to bless all the nations, which stands in complete contrast to wiping out a nation. And God listens to him. God's ear is bent towards Abraham and Abraham's pleas. And so I don't think we take from this that God's just going to continue to systemically wipe out people unless we ask God not to. I don't think that's the point of this story. I think the point of this story is Abraham's deep understanding of generosity and mercy. Does that make sense?
yeah, that clears the question.
Can I
I
speak?
forget about that.
Well, I also think it matters too if you view this as a story or as a historical occurrence.
Right.
Oh yeah, that was like 2 weeks ago.
Yes, and that's where this all becomes really complicated. If you read this text and you think that this is a historical event that took place, there's a whole other set of theological complications that this creates. And that's where many of us have been raised in Christianity, is that these are historical events, and therefore God at any moment is just going to wipe out people. Or that anytime there's a tsunami is because somebody pissed off God someplace. Or that anytime there's an earthquake that kills, or there's a tornado, but hurricane is actually what I was thinking of. That there's a hurricane that it's because God's angry. And we get that from reading these stories as literal history as opposed to ancient storytelling methods of morals, of the idea of who God is, of the idea of who the father of Hebrew faith is. And if you read, so like, just listen once, real quick. I'm going to read 2 sections of text. I don't want you to follow along. I just want you to listen and tell me if after reading these 2 sections, they don't sound like the author is intentionally connecting these 2 stories. And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, Do as you have said. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way. They said, No, we will spend the night in the town square, but he pressed them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Do you guys agree that there's a ton of similarities to the introduction of chapter 18 and the introduction of chapter 19? There's also significant opposites, right? Abraham is sitting in the entrance to a tent. Lot is sitting in the entrance to a walled city, right? Abraham promises or offers a small amount of food and makes them a feast. Lot doesn't even offer them any food until they come to his house, right? There's all these things that are happening, all these different pieces, but I would argue 18 and 19 are meant to parallel each other because we're meant to contrast the difference between Abraham and Lot, or at the very least, Abraham's household and Lot's current city where he's taking up residence. I love the other portion. So we talked so much about like all of what Abraham did. He abandons the Shekinah, however you want to pronounce it, the presence of God, and he runs out to the stranger. He stands before God and argues with God not to destroy the most wicked cities known to man, right? And then in addition to that is this piece that says, let me make you a little something to eat and get you a drink of water. And he turns around, and 3 seahs of flour is enough to make like 100 loaves of bread. And he goes and he kills a calf, and this is his morsel, right? Isn't that what the text says? Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring you a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves. I don't know about, although I did marry into an Italian family, so I do kind of know what let me make a small meal means. But here's another picture of Abraham that's just so powerful. Again, my experience growing up in the church was the church would promise on like things to like take care of people that have lack food security. They would say things like, you know what, let's gather up a whole bunch of food and stuff, right? And then participation would be like this much, right? And so you would actually instead have one grocery bag of food, and then it'd be like, well, you know what? They're poor. They'll take it, you know. Or let's do a clothing drive, and clothing comes with stains and holes in it, and it's like, well, if they really need a coat, they won't turn their nose up to it, right? And that becomes our mindset. We offer a feast and give a morsel, but Abraham, in his first example, offers a morsel and gives a feast. And I just think if we could build the concept of expressing our faith based on Genesis 18, it would transform the church. It would transform our community. Dare I say, the world, right? Like imagine if all of Christendom lived in the way that Abraham did, willing to stand before God and plead for mercy for those who really don't deserve mercy, at least according to our judicial system. Right? That we would stand before God, we would run to the stranger and offer them a morsel, would make a feast. I think all of these things are so rich. And we haven't even really got out of chapter 18 and we're out of time. And to even think about what goes on in 19 and what goes on about the fact that it says, and God remembers Abraham and rescues Lot. What a powerful statement. Right? In chapter 19, when Sodom and Gomorrah is being destroyed, and it says God remembers Abraham. Remember what we've talked about, the word remember? It's active. And in remembering, it brings about the rescue of Lot. One thing, I just really, to me, it's a non-issue, but for many people it isn't. I just want to read. The Bible tells us what has God so pissed off, okay, about Sodom and Gomorrah. We have created throughout the years some really terrible dialogue around this, but I'm going to read for you what the Bible says was wrong in Sodom, Gomorrah, and the other cities. Are you ready for it? Behold, this is the guilt of your sister city Sodom. Okay, pretty clear pronouncing of it. She and her daughters, meaning the other cities, had pride excess of food and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did an abomination before me. God is calling the abomination to be prosperous, to have means, and to not care for the poor. That is the abomination done by Sodom and its sister cities, or its daughters, I guess it says. That is so profound because, so I had the opportunity to speak at the Mennonite annual missional event, and this was probably about, oh man, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, right? And my topic was, my teaching title was, are we more like the city of Sodom or the kingdom of heaven? And needless to say, some of the people I was discipling went with me, and some friends went along as well. And not that the people I was discipling are friends as well, but anyhow. And they were joking before they called me up to speak that the car was running and they were ready for me to be run out of the building. Because as you can imagine, my conclusion is the church is more like Sodom than it is the kingdom of heaven. We are more like chapter 19 than we are like chapter 18. And we find all kinds of ways of justifying it. I knew I was in trouble at the Mennonite thing when I started walking up to the speaker's podium, and the person introducing me said, "Don't let his beard fool you. He is a pastor." And at that moment, I wanted to run and hide and not even get up and speak. What's that?
Did you make it up?
I did. And there was a huge line of people waiting to talk to me, and not all of them were positive, but many were. And actually, Tana always made a joke at that point when I did a lot of speaking on poverty and food sustainability and missional stuff. And Tana said, always would tease me, she'd say, "You are a favorite person to come and speak one time and never be invited back." So anyhow, I think that is really important, though, for us to hear, and I think it's true, unfortunately. I think that if we took Ezekiel 16:49, which is a passage I just read to you, and we thought about taking care of the poor and the needy, and we stack that up versus what Abraham lays out for us as the ideal of behavior, I think we would look way more like Sodom and her daughter cities than we look like Abraham in the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God that we're called to. I think that is sad, but I also find it hopeful because the church has done good things throughout history, and we have done it running at half speed. We've been jogging or treading water, and we still have done good things. Imagine how much more we could do if we actually took Genesis 18 seriously. Like, imagine how the world could be changed and transformed. So, any questions?
Quick one. Is there somewhere that states practically what might be a real scenario and what's the story, or is that just up for fun interpretation?
What's that?
Like, it'd be cool to see these stories are possibly just stories and these things are actually happened. I don't know if that.
Yeah, part of it's just the way you have to be familiar with ancient storytelling, particularly ancient Eastern storytelling. So, for instance, I believe that there was probably cities that existed that were known to have been Sodom.
I think there's evidence that suggests they were part of trade routes where those names were actually discovered.
Right. And so the physicality of the places, I would argue, is true. And I would even argue that most likely something devastating happened in those cities, and they had a reputation for something. And in order to understand how it happened, these fables or stories arose out of them. So a lot of these things have historicity. So it's something I said a few weeks ago or something where I said, you know, there's true and then there's historical, and they're not always the same, but they're also not always mutually exclusive, right? So Johnny Appleseed as we, learned about it in school, or we've seen it in TV movies or cartoons or something, is not remotely close to how Johnny Appleseed really functioned within early American frontierism. Another example that I think is maybe a better example of that is George Washington probably never literally cut down a cherry tree. But that story about George Washington saying, I cannot tell a lie, they cut down that cherry tree, is truthful. It became legend about him because he was known by his peers to be honest. And so there was truth, and it doesn't matter if he ever did actually cut down a cherry tree. It says something about his character. Does that make sense?
Yes, very different. I don't know why. It's really nice to go that in while I'm transitioning my perspective.
Certainly. And I would even point to probably the easiest way for us as Christians to understand this concept is to look at the parables of Jesus, right? None of us, I should say none of us, no scholarship, as far as I know, believe that the Good Samaritan story is a historical story, event, like actually took place. But within Christianity, it's taught all the time as true, right? That we should be good Samaritans. Or the parable of the lost sheep. Like, no one believes that there was actually literally 100 sheep, one shepherd responsible for them, one wandered off, and the shepherd went and found it and brought it back. Could it have happened? Of course. But we believe it to be true, even if it's not historical. For some reason, when we get into the Hebrew text, because we don't have someone standing there saying, let me tell you a parable about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and our father Abraham. If it said that, we would still teach Sodom and Gomorrah the same way that maybe not. Maybe not some of the really harmful ways we've taught Sodom and Gomorrah, but we would still handle it and feel completely okay with the Sodom and Gomorrah story. Does that make sense? Any other questions about this? This is one of my favorite sections of text. I know I say that a lot, but this one really is one of my favorites. For me, this has been one of the most transformational passages for me when thinking about what I want to be, who I want to be, how I want to behave within the world. This passage, chapter 18, and 19 will add so much more. I wish we had time. We need a day. But any questions or thoughts? What do you guys think about that teaching, viewing it that way? Is that helpful? Is it disconcerting? Is it hopeful? What is it? Sometimes you guys are really hard to read.
Intimidating / hopeful.
Yeah.
From myself.
Yeah.
It's a cool idea. It's hard to figure out how it's the applicability of in this situation, how do you not destroy yourself but live in that way, which I think takes a bit of training.
Yeah.
I think that's big on, but I think it's kind of cool that because 2 years ago when we were going through this section, I was struggling with the same exact things that Noah was struggling with.
Yeah.
Like, how do we fit in these stories into what we've been, and compare that to what we've been taught and how we should use it.
Yeah.
Just kind of cool.
So can you give Noah hope that?
Yeah, there's hope.
How you doing now?
And I'm still right there.
I just think it's interesting that most of the time what's taken out is God being brutal. And that's just interesting, I guess. So
Yeah.
that a lot of people forget about, I guess, the other 20 verses plus in the chapter.
Yeah.
Counteract that.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
Good to have both it makes it easier maybe to explain to somebody.
Sure. Yeah. I agree. One other piece of this story that I also love, and then I'll wrap it up unless someone has something specific they want to say, and maybe it's a lack of peace, is we also can't forget that Abraham was just circumcised. Just circumcised. And so not only does he abandon having a face-to-face with God to run out to these strangers, it's also hurt, I would imagine. And he still runs to them. And I think that's also really powerful. And it has been meaningful to me to think about, I can come up with 1,001 excuses not to do things. And it seems like this story just knocks down each one of my potential reasons. So, all right, anything else? All right, if you would like to stop the broadcast, actually, even if you don't like to, if you could stop the broadcast.